So the last 30 minutes of this community meeting will be our last Q&A. And I'm just going to start off with some questions. I know there are folks still handing in their questions, so if you can...
Or maybe could you have the planning department come up, and answer questions too?
Is the planning department willing to come up to answer questions?
Sure, I'll stand.
Or you can bring another seat of honor.
I'm more of a stander.
Yeah, I know. Do we have? Can we stand?
Oh yeah, if y'all want to stand,
like
okay.
Can we get, I didn't get her name. Can we get her name?
Kirsten, Angelica, Peter.
No, this one.
Angelica.
Angelica?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Nice job, Angelica.
Very good. Very
Great. So before we start, can we just give a big round of applause for our 3 presenters? It's daunting to present in front of so many smart people, I think. So thank you so much for being willing. The first question is another repeat question from the last round of Q&A, and it is, how does this plan address the current outstanding need for housing for those who make below $100,000, which is most of the folks who need housing to stay in the city? I think Kirsten, you already answered this, and if you want to jump in, but I'm going to turn it to Peter and Angelica, and then Kirsten, if you have anything to add. So, Peter.
Well, I think part of the answer to the question is what I was getting into. It has a lot to do with the size of the household as well as the amount of the income. And again, if you read our little paper, take this as for an example. If someone is a single person, and that's all they need in a studio or 1 bedroom, and they're making, say, $100,000 salary, they would qualify for some of these single bedroom units. So that's to kind of give you one idea of who would benefit from this. But if you're talking about a 3 or 4 person household, say a couple with a kid or 2, their income could be very different, and they might actually be at $100,000 or $110,000 a year, and perhaps that's the right place for this program. So there's a lot of mixing and matching based on, I think you really have to ask the question of who are you really trying to solve for, whose housing needs are most critical at this point. And it's not just the income all the time, because it also relates to the kind of household as well. That's a more technical answer, I think.
I think for us, we have to look at the history of rent control, right? Are we willing to give up rent-controlled units for new units, right? And again, looking at, are we getting enough or is the developer getting more than us? And weighing those things together before making really a decision of, is this a good program for our city in general? Because it's not just about, this is going to impact the whole city, not just the Richmond or other part or certain neighborhoods.
And I'll just add, I did talk about how many different units would be added for different income levels, but I do think the unit size is really interesting and important. We know that about 60% of our current households are single-person households. Many of them are living in multi-bedroom buildings together to be able to afford it. So I just asked this question of how do we ensure that we have a diversity of housing supply for a diversity of household types so that people can move to the type that best fits their needs? And that would be kind of a further thought on that question.
Cool. This question was also asked in the last round of Q&A, and that is regarding the expedited placement for displaced tenants. What happens once they're out of their union but have nowhere to go? And then this one was just submitted, which is there any realistic expectation that displaced residents and businesses can return, and what will they do in the meantime? I'm going to start with Angelica, then Peter, and then Kristen, if you have anything to add.
To us, we haven't seen people that are displaced or was removed and actually came back, right? It's really hard for people to do that. Look at the black population in San Francisco. It's less than 3%. And they're prioritized to actually be on those housing, but yet they haven't been able to move back. So those are the questions we need to think about, including, in the Sato market, we hear a lot about we need to develop to have affordable housing. But look at what's happening in our community. Developers are able to develop things right away, but affordable housing takes so long, right? And the city needs to really think about how to make sure money comes back to affordable housing, not remove taxes from corporations like the payroll tax.
And I would just add, in our mind, this is too hard to try to solve. The potential for displacement of tenants and how do you make sure they can come back and what do they do in the meantime? The easiest answer is there should be zero opportunity to demolish existing housing, period. Not temporary, not... The old saying is, the most affordable housing someone has is the roof over their head. So I know there's some clarification on whether or not it's temporary or not, and maybe that needs to be just clarified and rock solid. But if that's the situation, never can, never will, then that really takes care of that issue, because I think otherwise the conversation about how do you mitigate the potential for displacement is never ending for all the reasons Angelica said. The other part of the question is about businesses. It's very difficult that we don't have, under state law, an ability to protect small businesses. So they're always in a very vulnerable situation. One of the first things we see in gentrifying neighborhoods is that local small business that gets priced out, right? And we know that that's kind of like a little precursor for what's to come. The difference in this one, I would argue, and Choo-Choo's more on the housing side of it, but I have a lot of neighborhood experience, is this is not just going to happen on its own. This is potentially going to happen because it's been incentivized by city action. Remember I said that the city, by changing zoning and density, is conferring property value, right? Well, part of the responsibility then becomes, if conferring property value prices out of business, what kind of entitlement should they have to be taken care of as part of that increased value? That's the question on the table. And I don't know what the right answer is, but to sort of say you get a longer period of time to figure out Plan B, which for most displaced businesses ultimately means shutting down, it may be a question of how can you ensure that they get some kind of accommodation to come back at a rent that they can afford. Just an idea.
Peter alluded to what our program has offered for small businesses, but I just want to go through that detail. We have been working really closely with the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, which I'm going to just call OEWD, which is just shorter. But their job really is to help retain small businesses. I know in your district there is an Invest in Neighborhoods corridor that the supervisor is working with OEWD and our department on to really help understand the business needs of small businesses. These are our experts. We went to them and we said, there's going to be some small businesses that could get displaced through this program. What should we do? What is the programmatic response? What can the city do? Give me the best, brightest, awesomest program option. And they said actually the biggest issue is business finds out it's getting evicted or just its lease is up, something, and then they have very little time to develop a business plan, find a new space, raise capital, and actually do the tenant improvements to the new space. So we are requiring that any project that files with the planning department, and by the way, some of you may be surprised to hear this, it takes 3-5 years to get from idea to construction. So that gives the business a long period of time to do all of that planning. Also, in that letter that they receive 3 years ahead of time will be a connection to OEWD that provides technical assistance, any financial resources that should come to help support small businesses in the city, those who are displaced or need to renovate in some way.
Cool, thanks. For the sake of time, would folks be okay if the questions that Kirsten already answered, we limit it to the new panelists, and then for new questions thereafter we can say for everybody? Is that okay with folks? Thumbs up? That's okay? Okay. A couple of thumbs, but that's okay. The next question, which was already asked to Kirsten, but I'll ask again, is the ban on rent-controlled units temporary or permanent in your opinion?
It sounds like, Thursday evening there was a meeting in Noe Valley. The planning staff has been emphatic that it's permanent. I think we need to get that clarified. Honestly, what we have seen anyway, as part of the staff packet, the exhibit that outlines the amendment that was introduced, makes it permanent, but ultimately contingent upon the possibility of a study and recommendations and policies that would be adopted by the Planning Commission and Board that would then basically have appropriate mitigation for the displacement of tenants, which means if you read that for its possibilities, it's still an open possibility, but in the meantime, it's excluded. Now, if there's something that's more absolute and permanent and not contingent, I think we all want to know.
I think it's challenging when they're changing the zoning in our neighborhood, and they're still trying to figure out how they're going to help bring us back to our community, right? And this is similar to like the traffic issues we're facing in the South of Market. They have all this changing of traffics, and they'll figure out how it's going to flow later on, and it's not working. So the city really needs to think of a good plan first with us in the table, and then execute it, not the other way around.
So this question's new. So Kirsten, maybe we'll start with you, and then Angelica, and then Peter. This question is development. Okay, development in the mission over the past 15 years has created major sewer problems in like, for example, on 17th and Folsom. Present density developments created these infrastructure problems and will only be duplicated. What is being done to ensure that these types of mistakes will not be repeated in the Richmond?
I am not a sewer expert, but what I do understand is right at 17th and Folsom, there's actually an underground creek that gets floods, and I don't believe that has any direct correlation to the changes in development. However, I want to be totally clear. This program has environmental review. One of the components of environmental review is really looking at our infrastructure, especially our hard infrastructure like sewer and water. So if you want to take a look at what the city's strategic plan is for that, that document is available on our website. And also I know the PUC are working really hard to help our city get better at rainwater runoff because we have combined sewers. I will take a discussion about combined sewers after the meeting.
So I'll use the traffic as another just easier example. It's really, I can't answer exactly to that question, but what we learned is a lot of departments don't actually talk to one another, right? From DPT, DPH, MTA, to the planning department. So they're all creating their own plan, and then they expect your neighborhood to just take it all in, and then they'll figure it out later. It wasn't until we started getting involved in the pedestrian safety that we learned how this functions and how all these departments are collaborating, and that's not good because they're supposed to look at our whole city, not just about their project. And we expect better leadership from the city about that. And those are things that we're actually demanding that the city does. So they don't have this ongoing problems, and we have to just suck up all these issues and figure it out later.
Cool. So this next question is also new. The question is, this program allows little parking in the building. Where will tenants park their cars? We don't have a citywide subway system like other districts. And it's related to some other concerns that we've received about muni infrastructure. What will the city do in order to provide for an influx of new tenants and new potential homeowners through this program? And I think we can start with Peter and then...
In affordable housing, we tend to have very little parking. The populations that we are often trying to serve are usually not auto-dependent. So many of our 100% affordable housing projects have zero parking or very little parking. Seniors, disabled, very low-income families are very heavily transit-dependent. So I guess my focus would be on the transit infrastructure part of that question. I know many of you may have concerns about the parking. I mean, I've got 2 kids, I got a car, and I got to park it on the street, so there's a reality. But it a bit relates to the previous question because as we try to move more and more San Franciscans to using vehicles less and using transit more, or bicycles, or whatever it is, that infrastructure has to come online, because otherwise it becomes an aspiration for which there's no reality. And I think that's what was being asked, and it's hard to do, frankly. So my suggestion there is advocate hard for the transportation infrastructure to be put in place versus battling for parking, but that's more of my own editorial. I will also say it's interesting that the city is simultaneously already, it's something to be approved, but implementing 2 citywide fairly significant programs. One is a car share program that is going to be taking street parking spaces and converting them to car share spaces. I think it's 300 or 400 spaces throughout the city. So that's a kind of net parking supply that will be converted. And secondly is a bike share program, which my understanding is like an 800 or 900 parking spaces throughout the city will be converted to bicycle sharing pods. So the parking pinch is a reality, and I'm not saying that as a negative, I'm just saying it's a real issue that you need to think about how people get around as housing development expands.
I just that is perfect in an area where there is not the age diversity, and most of the people I think that are living out here are, they're not like in their 20s. I'm not saying they aren't.
Neither am I.
But I mean, like, I'm 60 now, and I moved here when I was 20 to this neighborhood, and I've just lost more and more spaces. And my job is car related. I can't do, and a lot of people in the city, there's a lot of people that don't rely on their car daily, other than laziness.
Well, I think that's kind of a planning department question, comment.
Yeah, always.
So, Angelica, do you have anything to add?
No answer.
I would just add, we also don't advocate for more parking, but to really make sure if you are advocating for transportation that you are still part of where those money goes to make sure that it comes back to your priority, right? I know Supervisor had been advocating for better buses in this area for a very long time, but what did we see 2011, 2012? The city instead put buses where the Twitter buildings are instead of helping alleviate and better the existing buses we already have. So really making sure that what they're putting those investment on is in our neighborhoods.
So I will add that the city is working really hard to develop a comprehensive transportation plan, and it's being done in multiple phases. We've just completed all the planning, which in my mind is about getting our system up to par. It's now, I think, being called Muni Forward, and it's a way to really look at our bus system and our rail system and make it perform really well. There are a number of funding sources that you voted on in the past year or so. Bonds, as well as a new impact fee. That means when a developer builds a building, they pay a certain amount of money to help offset the cost of new infrastructure we need to support them for transportation specifically. So projects that are built through this program would also pay into that fund. It helps us to make sure that we're kind of moving along with our funding sources. Those funds are not enough to fix Muni, but they are what we use as our local match to leverage federal and state dollars. And Gil is sitting in the back. He, if you have questions afterwards, can talk to you about not just our local transportation planning, but he's also engaged in our regional transportation planning, because that's really where the big decision making and the big thinking about how do we move people more efficiently and more sustainably over time.
You didn't answer her question about parking, about seniors,
Parking and seniors, I get it. So parking. The city has, for a long time, had a planning code. We had the first planning code in the U.S. It was not until the 50s that we even had parking requirements. So our city went and said, oh my gosh, we have all this housing, we had no parking requirements. Let's require that for each housing unit, you have one parking space. Okay, we've been building not that much housing, but some since the 50s. So those units all have one-to-one parking. Then we have a bunch of people who own buildings and said, oh, well, I'd like to add a garage even though my building wasn't built with it. We're still not parked at one-to-one or anywhere near that. We've also learned that, when you add a garage and you put your one car there, you remove an on-street parking space. So you basically have privatized that one piece. When it comes to managing this asset or this resource, you've reduced the utility of that space. So there's a lot of thinking we're doing about what is that right ratio. And there's nobody in the city that thinks people are going to stop driving, but there are a lot of people working on what we call transportation demand management, making sure you're using the car for the trips you need it, and the walking to your neighborhood store, biking to whatever you can bike to, and transiting otherwise. So what we really want is to see people using the right tools and to make those tools available for them.
Especially when you're 70, right? You use all the various tools.
Probably you would be more on the transit than the biking, but there are many 7-year-olds out on Hawk Hill that beat me up to the top. So.
Cool. Okay. Next question. Beyond the 240 soft sites, doesn't the affordable housing bonus program threaten over time demolition of up to 30,500 buildings? Doesn't the affordable housing bonus program legalize such potential demolition? Let me start with Angelica and then Peter. Oh, cool. Then Peter.
I think this is back to the earlier question about the relocation, and Kirsten already talked upon, Gil's mentioned. Maybe, I don't want to kind of put planning on the spot, but I have the Exhibit E from the January 28th staff report. This is what's going to Planning Commission this week. And maybe it can be clarified for all of us here what this is saying, because again, my read of this is that sites that demolish, remove, or convert any units subject to the rent control ordinance are not eligible. And then, quote, unless and until the planning department study required in section 206.8 is completed and any legislative action taken. What that is a very kind of elaborate thing that says by January of 2017, so essentially a year, the planning department is going to do a study and the planning commission is going to make recommendations to the board of supervisors about whether and what kind of mitigation can happen to replace existing housing with new construction. So it sounds, from my read, like the question is still on the table. It doesn't mean that it will happen. They may run into a wall and say no possible way to do it, and it's just a sort of so-called dead on arrival. But that's the way this is set up, and I think what most of you have been hearing is it's totally off the table, forever, done, gone, and I'm not sure that's what I'm reading. So I'm just wondering, can you clarify?
Thank you.
Sure, yeah, I can clarify. So the original question is, are 30,000 buildings parcels about to be redeveloped over through this plan? I just want to say all of these parcels have existing zoning. We really believe that the affordability level that we're requesting is quite high. So the extra 2 stories isn't this giant incentive that it might feel like. And I'm happy to walk through that feasibility. And then to Peter's question, is it definite? Every room I've been in and every conversation I've had with Supervisor Breed's staff, the mayor, Supervisor Tang, and our department have said this is definite. And rent control is a serious and important affordable housing supply, and we want to study it over the next year. So I think there's a motion kind of brewing to have that study be decoupled from this and just really be about rent control preservation, because that's actually our intent. So I think...
So this might be modified by the 28th?
Absolutely can be modified.
But
So
you don't say stop it, you say spend it. And yet rent control has been around since at least 79.
I know, and do you know what? I've been working for the city for 10 years. We have very little information about this very important affordable housing supply, and that is why we want to study it.
Actually, there's several studies that have already studied it.
In 2002, there's a very incomprehensive study. If you've got more, I'd
Well,
love
we
to
do know the exact number of rent-controlled units in the city, down to the number. I mean, we track it every year, and I got to tell you, the number keeps going down because of conversions. But
Anyway, so
without quibbling with planning, it sounds like that this Exhibit E may actually be modified by the commission date. But I think it's fair to say at least why the public may be confused is because this is out there, and this is what the current proposal is, and if it's going to be tightened, until then, most of us still feel like there's some potential unknown.
But the mayor and Katie Kane can do it right now, today, without any question, by themselves.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope that folks know rent control is really important, and it sounds like there are a lot of concerns about it. And just for the sake of time, we have 5 minutes, and I have a set of questions and one last question, and I think folks will stick around afterwards if there are additional questions about rent control and other aspects of this program. So this set of questions is all around how the Affordable Housing Bonus Program might change or diminish the role of the Planning Commission. And Kirsten's already spoken to some of these questions, so I'm just going to try and combine them into one. But the question is, doesn't the Affordable Housing Bonus Program greatly diminish the role of the Planning Commission if they can only make minor changes once the plan is approved? And then sort of in addition to that, what is the appeal process after the project is approved if we were to pass the Affordable Housing Bonus Program?
So you want Kirsten to?
I already answered that one, right?
Okay.
Yes, you've answered it. So one of you could, yeah.
Well, maybe I could give, if you will, a little bit more kind of the technical, our technical understanding of it, and then I think it'd be helpful for Angelica and Lottie because you're dealing with development proposals on the ground and how that process becomes an important tool. In our understanding of the way this is being rewritten, and it does appear that there's a whole new section of the planning code that's been drafted, and these projects would be subject to that approval process rather than the current approval process, is the fundamental difference is that they don't require conditional use authorization. And a conditional use authorization is how most, at least larger scale development, and certainly development that has increased height requests, would normally be approved. And what it means is that the Planning Commission has the discretion to decide, and this is actually the words of the Planning Code, whether the proposal is necessary, desirable, and compatible with its surroundings. And I know that sounds very subjective, so they have to build a whole argument for why it is or isn't or what it would take to make it necessary, desirable, and compatible. But what it appears to be is that kind of litmus test that's in the hands of the Planning Commission as a total discretion has been replaced by a process that does a lot of internal staff review and kind of code checkoff compliance and design review. And the Planning Commission is effectively shifted to more of a design review body. Now they might have still some teeth to be able to say we're not ready for this project or we want to make some modifications to it from a design standpoint. And of course the community still has the public hearing, which I know planning staff has said at the end of the day it's the public hearing that's most important. But I do think that the more substantive difference is the role and the power, if you will, that the Planning Commission has in making its decision from a discretionary one to one that's effectively a design review. And then to the second part of the question, the appeal process, should you decide that the planning department or staff didn't do a good job, if you know, whatever, under a conditional use approval, that appeal is to the Board of Supervisors. It doesn't happen a lot, folks. It's a lot of work, as you know. But it gives the community a chance to say, we think that this needs to be taken to our elected officials because it is a discretionary decision of the city, and we're going to appeal and make our case, and you may or may not win. The appeal process under the new system would be to another body called the Board of Permit Appeals, which is, you know, they're appointees. They're not elected officials. They're appointees, and they have an important role. But it's a very different kind of venue to make your case than if you're able to appeal to the Board of Supervisors. Now, again, as I said earlier, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? For the moment, I'll be kind of agnostic on it. I will say, though, that it is a change and a reduction of community power, community leverage. If you all think that what you get in exchange for that is worth it, then that's your judgment. But that's what's, I think, on the table.
in my opinion, in terms of, it's great there's public processes, but at the same time, if the development is fast-tracked for the corporation, then it's hard for the community to be actually part of a good community planning process. And we've seen this through the 5M project, we've seen it through other projects in our neighborhood and city. But what I would just add is really just organizing and mobilizing each other and not just, and educating your neighbors, but also not waiting for these hearings to come to actually start setting up meetings with those commissioners and other bodies to make sure that they already know your concern before it even gets to them. Majority of the time, the planning commissioners have this amount of things to study, different projects, and they have less than a week to read all through that. They won't know all the issues of how it's going to impact your neighborhood with just a week. They need more than that, right? So I would suggest that you also educate them about your community, walk them through your neighborhood and what your issues are versus just waiting for these hearings.
I just have one last question, and this one's directed towards Peter and Angelica, and please keep it a little brief.
Sorry.
No. We've loved your answers so far. So the last question is, what do you see as an alternative to this program?
20 words or less.
We're doing this like I go first. Well, as I said from the beginning, I think we believe that you can do density right. And in many respects, all the 7 questions that we've raised here can and should be answered in crafting an alternative approach that does it right. I think, looking very carefully and aggressively at how much we expect it to capture back, so this isn't just simply incentivizing the private market, but getting public goods, to getting the income targets right, so you're really providing affordable housing for those who need it the most, to making sure you decide how much of it should be family-sized units and how much not, to the questions about protecting businesses and tenants, and ultimately to how much should the community still have a say over it. I think you can take all of those things and craft something that uses the tools that the planning department is trying to do here, but to make sure you're getting the most outcome and preserving community and community power in the process. I do think that that's possible, and we want to work on that in one way or the other.
I don't know what alternative. There's a lot of things to think about, right? But what I do know is definitely organizing and educating each other and mobilizing together. Doing community meetings just like this, not just today, but ongoing to actually create what you want to see in your neighborhood, right? But also linking that with other neighborhoods, so we could actually come with a consolidated idea, not just for the Richmond, but how can that actually complement all the way to the mission, to the SOMA, to the TL. So it's, again, to me, there's no one answer to these things, but definitely using the tools and working together is what we see has the most impact to a lot of these issues that's happening in our community.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming.